All right. We're going to pick up in Ephesians chapter 5. Pick up in Ephesians chapter 5. Give you a second to find it. So we're in a section. We're in a section in Ephesians chapter 5 that really begins in verse 21. I know there's a break there, and I understand it because 21, the statement that is 21 is at the end of a sentence, and he does then enter the subject. But the problem is if we don't understand that 21 is setting the stage for all the relationships that we have with one another in Christ. And so and I was saying this last week, but want to repeat it just as we move further. What Paul is saying is that we all submit one to another in Christ. Wives submit to husbands, and husbands submit to wives. Children submit to parents, and parents submit to children. And if you're thinking, but submitting means you follow the orders of the other, then there's no way you can have mutual submission. If we think it's about position, power, and who gets to make the decisions, then it has to be a hierarchy. But and this is what I think it is, if Paul is talking about how we love one another in the imitation of Christ, then I submit to you and you submit to me, because it's not about who gives the orders and who does the following of the orders. It's about submitting to another person means I put my desires and needs and wishes on a lower level and put as first priority what are that person's desires, needs, wishes. And I serve them. And that we can do with one another. That can be mutual. And I think that's what Paul's talking about. So it's this idea of be subject, my version says, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. In other words, because of the way we honor Christ in our lives, we are going to be subject or submit to one another, each one of us to the other. Okay? That's what he's talking about. And as I mentioned, he starts and says a little bit to wives, which is not radical for that culture. He just says, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. But then he really starts to talk to the husbands, even though he's still talking, quote unquote, to the wives. For the husband is the head of the wife, and that then we took time to explain means he is the one who supports and gives to his wife. And so he is the life giver to her. It's not he's her boss. He's the source out of which she receives. And so it's out of his love and provision and his care and what he's doing that he is enriching her life. That's what he's supposed to be doing. So that's, and what we were reading, so we're in Ephesians 5, and we got down to, he's been discussing all of this about, as I said, mainly re-envisioning what it means to be a husband in the ancient world. And it's radical for those, well, it's still radical today, unfortunately. It's still radical. But it was even more unthinkable. No one had ever heard someone say a husband is to be the source for his wife. That's what he means by head. That he is to be that life-giving source for her, as Christ is for the church. And not put it in he's to be her master and she's to be his slave. That would have been the typical cultural thing. He's in charge, it's a man's world, and she exists to meet his every need and cater to whatever that is. Right? That would have been the way it was. And Paul is totally blowing that up. He's giving a different picture. So what I want us to notice, we got down to verse 31. And I asked the question, well, let's read 28 and then we'll get to 31, the question I asked about it. So 28, so husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies, as they would themselves, right? So the same way in which you are to love your neighbor as yourself. Sometimes at weddings I've said, you're marrying your first neighbor. This person is your first neighbor, right? And if you can't love this neighbor that you're going to live with well, don't tell me how you love your neighbors, right? Because if you're not doing that here, you're not doing that anywhere. This is where you're doing it most of the time, right? So it's the same standard. It's you love as yourself, which means, I think, more than in the same manner you would love yourself, but even more than that, as you love yourself, seeing that yourself is and includes this other person. We are united, and so I can't love and not love this person, because that would be like self-hatred, right? This is the same as myself. This other person becomes to me myself. And the proper care that I would give myself, I now extend to this other individual. So husbands also ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. It's just as simple as that. If that is loving yourself. To love your wife is to love yourself. He's saying, again, to husbands in the ancient world, Greeks or Jews, this was different stuff. This was different. Like I said, unfortunately, it's still different today. It's not as common as we would want it to be, or even in the church, it's not as common as we would hope it to be. So he goes on, 29, for no one ever hated his own flesh. So you just say, you could say, well, people have, yes, but those people are insane. Those people are crazy. They're not in their right mind. They're self-destructive. So the point is, no one in their right mind hates their own flesh. So how could you not then love as yourself your spouse? How could you hate or demean or put at a lower standard or whatever in place this person who is to be identified with yourself, right? That's his reasoning. But nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ also does the church. So Christ is the head of his body, and he nourishes and cherishes his body. You are the head, he's speaking to the husbands, of your wife. So she is your body, and you nourish and cherish her. You're the head that gives life to her, right? So it's not the boss. It's not the one who makes all the decisions, and for her to be submissive, she just has to accept your every decision without question. Sometimes Marcia has done well to question my decisions, not in any sort of awful way, but because she knew something smart, and she was smarter on some issue than I was, and I needed to hear her input. It's always been collaborative with us. It's not like I know better, I'll make the decisions around here. We make them together. She keeps all the finances because she's a detailed person, and she gets everything meticulously correct. If I kept the finances, we'd be in trouble, right? The records would be sloppy and incomplete, right? So we figure out among us what each of us does better, and we flourish together because we complement and we accept, oh, you do that better than me. You then take the lead. You make those decisions better than I do, right? There's not some sort of God-given thing that I need to make the decisions, right? So he compares this to Christ and the church. And then 30, just as Christ, end of 29, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. So we are one flesh with Christ. We are members of his body, and he is the head of the body, and he provides for it. Then comes the verse from Genesis, which is really strange. It's certainly strange in Genesis. So here it is. I think it's Genesis 2:24 or something. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, the point I made was, this is not descriptive descriptive in any way of Jewish culture. Okay? And I threw out the example last week of, you remember when the story of when they wanted to get a wife for Isaac? Of course, they're living over in Canaan, and they send the servant back to the home country to pick out a good woman for Isaac, right? He goes to the well, he meets this woman. Does he leave his father and mother to go be joined with his wife? No, she comes from the homeland to be joined with him where he is. That was Jewish culture. What we call that in anthropology is patrilocal. So when we, as an anthropologist, not that I'm an anthropologist, I've been trained in it, but I'm not trained enough to be called an anthropologist. But what an anthropologist would do, looking at a culture, one of those things would be, what is the nature of the relationships? Are they matrilineal or patrilineal? Most cultures are patrilineal. The ancestry passes through the men. But there are cultures where they are matrilineal, where the ancestry is counted through the women. Interestingly enough, Jewish culture is matrilineal. It's matrilineal. That's why Timothy is considered a Jew, because his mother is Jewish, but his dad is Greek. But why is he considered a Jew? Because it's matrilineal. The Jewishness is counted as coming through the female side. But a lot of cultures are patrilineal, right? But another question anthropologists would ask is the culture patrilocal or matrilocal? In other words, when a family is formed, do they tend to go and live with the husband's side, or do they tend to go and live with the wife's family? You know what our culture is? It's neolocal. The family creates its new location that is neither at the father's house, at the husband's house, nor at the wife's house, right? We're neolocal. Generally, the new couple goes and establishes a new home. But in a lot of cultures, oh no, they're going to move in with his mom and dad or her mom and dad, whether it's patrilocal or matrilocal. Does that make sense? So Jewish culture is matrilineal. It traces the heritage through the mother's side, but it's patrilocal. It establishes new homes at the husband's side of the family. So you got this odd verse in Genesis which says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they will become two. The two will become one flesh. And that's not what Jews do.
Could it be that maybe it's referring to the fact that he becomes the head of the household? I don't mean head like boss, since we were talking about that, but you know what I mean? It's more of now it's his responsibility. I'm trying to somehow save this verse.
Well, let me give us a clue on how to understand what in the heck is this saying if it's not what Jews are doing. And obviously they didn't see it as a command, either that or they've been like, well, for all our generations we've never followed what we were commanded to do, which men are supposed to leave their parents when they get married, which is not what they were doing, right? Paul tells us, read the next verse. This mystery is great. Basically, he's acknowledging we've never understood what this verse meant, right? He's saying, in other words, this verse has been stuck in our law of Moses for centuries, and we've never had a clue as to what it was talking about, because it's not what we did. He says, this mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Guess what Paul says? This verse is about Jesus. So how is this verse that he's quoting from Genesis 2 about Jesus? How does Jesus leave his father and mother to be joined as one flesh with his wife? How is that about Jesus?
Maybe the church.
Okay. The wife is the church. Okay.
He comes to earth.
Okay, he leaves his father because of the incarnation, right? He leaves his father, he leaves heaven. See, Paul sees this as a poetic, metaphorical reference to Christ, which has been embedded in the Hebrew Scriptures for all these centuries, and nobody's known what to do with it. So he says, it's been a great mystery. But the thing about mysteries is that they can be revealed, right? A mystery is a mystery because we've not understood it, but then maybe God has revealed the mystery, like the mystery of what he's been doing in Christ. And here Paul is saying, this has been a great mystery, but now we know what this verse has always meant. Jesus left his father, okay? How did he leave his mother? Who was his mother? Mary. How did he leave her? At the cross? At the cross, right? He says to the beloved disciple, who may be John, says, woman, here's your son, here's your mother. So he leaves his father, he leaves his mother to be joined to his wife, who is the church, right? And they become one flesh. Now, what has he just said? No one has ever hated his own flesh. And to the men, he's saying, and your wife is your flesh. And this is, I'm speaking about Christ and the church. You take as an example, what did Jesus do for the church? That's how you are a husband to your wife. Right? That's exactly what he said. It's nothing about being the boss and giving instructions and being the one in charge. It's about you would die and give your life for the sake of your wife. That's what Christ has done for the church. That's the model for being husbands. And that's the meaning, the prophetic meaning of this verse in Genesis that we've never understood, is that's Jesus. Right? So if you read the whole section, and you start to realize he's using this to support his view of the marital relationship, particularly the role of men, which was toxic and very, very dictatorial in the ancient world, and he's trying to absolutely change that. And he's charting a brand new sort of relationship that no one has ever seen nor practiced in the ancient world. Right? I don't know. Is that thoughts, questions?
That almost sounds like spiritual reading.
Of course it is. Yeah, it's an it's like Jesus says when you read the scriptures, they speak about me. There is a spiritual reading of all the Old Testament that is only about Jesus. That's what Jesus himself tells us. Is when you read those scriptures, they speak about me. Now, they're not literally. Well, I thought it was about a man who built an ark. How's that about Jesus? Jesus would say, yes, but ultimately that's about me. Right? Somehow that story is reflecting God and God coming to us in the person of Christ, in the person of Jesus. So all of it speaks to the nature of God when understood well, which is, again, not understanding it on the strictly literal level, but seeing a spiritual meaning that supersedes in importance the literal meaning. That's how Paul is reading Scripture, right? So he sees Jesus in that. So the mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Then he says, nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. Right? So it's mutual love and respect from one to the other. And most of the change in the ancient world needed to happen on the husband's side. The wives would get to live into a much better world than they ever imagined possible if their husbands actually were acting like Christians, right? The wives would be like, I never expected it could be this good, because their expectations were not that you would be treated this way. But it was the men who had to do the changing from the cultural expectations. That's what was going on.
That sheds a whole new light in my world, having two sons, and I always expected the wife to come first, but I'd never thought about her family coming first. Pretty much, that's how it is.
Often it works out that way. Yeah, it does work out that way.
Well,
Yeah.
and it's according to the individual situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think about my son when he was 14, and we're having dinner one night, and I said, well, Emily set the table, so you should clear the table. And Chris said, that sounds like one. And I said, I know you weren't going to say one. And he said, no, ma'am. I said, good. Because I said, there's no woman's work. There's work.
Yeah, there's work.
And we all share.
Yeah, that's right.
how-
And he did, and he cleaned up.
And he cleaned up, that's right, because in our family, and when Emily finished high school, when she left home, John said to me, I'm stopping eating dinner now because dinner's is making me fat. And I thought, I don't think it's dinner that's making you fat, I think it's those peanut butter sandwiches. But I didn't say anything to him about that because I had just started Cobb Valley Healthcare, and if I wanted to work till 8 o'clock at night, I didn't have to be home at 5 to cook dinner. And so that was like 25 or 30 years ago. And my friends are shocked when I don't have to be home to cook dinner, but every family works things out
Yeah.
for everybody.
Right.
It's different, but it's not wrong. It's
Right.
just your
Yeah.
individual situation.
Yeah, what this is not doing is delegating out men's roles and women's roles, husband's place and wives' place. No, it's not some sort of hierarchy. It's
Right.
very mutual. That's why he starts off saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Right.
And then I have to ask, how do I submit to my spouse? If I'm the husband, how do I submit to my wife? Because again, it's not about who gets to make the decisions. It's how do I value her needs, her wants, her wishes above my own, and how do I help meet that?
Exactly.
That's what it means, right? It's not about decision making. It's about serving each other out of love,
Right.
and that can be mutual. And that's why when we get to the next section, he starts talking to children and parents. You could say, well, how are parents supposed to submit to their children? Because if you're thinking, well, you mean I'm supposed to do what they say? This isn't about doing what another says. This is about loving selflessly. And how do parents love selflessly their children? He's going to tell the fathers how they're going to do that. And he's going to say that, I think, to the fathers and not to the mothers, because I suspect in the ancient world the mothers were already doing this well. But it was the dads who weren't. Not only were they not being good husbands, they weren't being good fathers. You think there's a pattern here, right? The culture was not grooming men to either be good husbands in a Christian sense or good fathers in a Christian sense. But let's look at what he says, right? Because again, it's mutual. And he always starts with the one who in that cultural situation was already and it was hierarchical, who was on the bottom side of that relationship, the vulnerable one. So he spoke first to wives and then to husbands. He's going to speak first to children and then to the fathers, because the children were the vulnerable ones, right, in the cultural moment, in their culture, right? So first he affirms to the children, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. I mean, you should obey your parents, right? He's saying that's a good thing. And he quotes again Old Testament, Hebrew scripture. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, because there's a promise, and he cites what the promise is, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Okay, so that's his statement to children. But then he speaks to the husbands, to the fathers of these children. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now that's short, but there's a lot in there. What can we infer is going on by what he says to the fathers?
Have you ever tried raising kids with you're the boss? Direction, how
Yeah.
Jesus calls us to follow him. He doesn't force us to follow him. So
Love is not mandatory.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The love is not mandatory. Jesus doesn't force us. I mean, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. What does that imply? What is he talking about? What has transpired that makes the children angry? How are fathers provoking their children to anger?
They're exerting power over the child.
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. Yeah.
Telling them what to do.
Yeah, in a way, because he contrasts that, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction. So instruction means tell them, but provoking them to anger, I think, implies telling them in a different manner, right? I mean, he's not saying, you got nothing to instruct. Yes, you are to instruct and to discipline. You're going to train, you're going to try and form, you're going to try and shape. But how do you do that without provoking them to anger?
Don't yell at them or manipulate them or intimidate them.
Right, okay. Yeah, so think of all the negative ways. You can be arbitrary, you can be overly demanding, you can set unachievable goals. You know, I mean, there's so many ways in which the children can be frustrated. Okay, you're not instructing them and disciplining them in a way that they're growing up in the Lord. You're just being too dictatorial, you're being too demanding, you're either manipulating or threatening. I mean, there's a lot of negative ways to instruct, right? That then becomes harsh, and the children become angry, frustrated under this kind of rule. Yeah, it's too authoritarian, right? And I think simply the thing about when we demand that certain things are done but never explain why. I said it, just do it. Well, I might have a reasonable question to say, why? Not because I'm being, rebellious, but because I'm trying to understand, right? I mean, I can think of so many scenarios in which there's a way to instruct. Now, a child may still become angry, but that may be the child's fault at that point. It may not be that I provoked that. But I've got to, as the father, and I think it could apply to mothers as well, obviously. I just think in the ancient world, that wasn't where the problem was coming. The fathers were king of the household, they ordered their wives around, and they ordered their children around, and everything revolved around them, right? And so the wives were ill-treated, and the children were ill-treated. And so they had to change that role. But obviously, we could broaden the question and say both fathers and mothers today. How are we instructing, how are we disciplining in a way that's bringing them up well? Because we have that responsibility. To love our children well is to teach them things. If you neglect to teach them, you don't love them, right? Because then, if you don't teach them, you leave them vulnerable to all sorts of mistakes and things in life. But if you love them, you say, hey, you don't want to do that, you want to do this is better for you, this is worse for you. So there's a way to do that, but there's a way to do that that can be, like Marcia was saying, manipulative or, different techniques. Great one in my household that made me angry was shaming. I was threatened with shaming, public humiliation. My dad would say, I'll just stop in the middle of the sermon and call you out. Thanks, Dad. I like going to church. I love sitting in the church, scared to death in the pew. If I misbehave, my dad's going to humiliate me in front of the whole church, and I'm, 6 years old. That's not helpful. That doesn't create any sort of bond of love, or So, and we've all experienced those. I can just throw that one out. We've all experienced those kinds of things where people maybe meant well, but didn't know a technique to instruct and discipline that didn't involve threats of this or that, right?
And they learn what they were raised in too, if that's
Well,
how they were raised.
Right, because I'm sure. I mean, my parents were born in 1922, and both my parents be over 100 now. So I had parents the age of most of my peers' grandparents. So yeah, they grew up. They were Depression era people, right? So I know, I mean, to say that is not to disparage that they weren't doing the best they could, but that's definitely how they grew up. And my dad didn't grow up in a Christian home at all. So he was doing the best he could, but I look back now and go, you know, or even when I was raising my kids, like, I am never going to want to threaten to shame them. Humiliation, fear of humiliation is not a great teaching tool. My experience is it does not work well. It might force compliance, but compliance is not the same as obedience. You know.
So Cameron had a bad habit of leaving lights on.
Yeah.
You know, we had lots of discussions about stuff. And finally I said, well, okay. So every time I find lights left off, you lose a light. And so over time, she had a room with no lights. And then she said, Dad, can I have a light bulb? And so, and to this day, she remembers that. But I was teaching her without threatening.
Yeah, that can you can teach in ways that can get the point across, but it doesn't have to threaten, such negative things, dire consequences. It can be, I've got to teach you this, but how can I do it in a way that doesn't make you frustrated, angry, bitter about the whole experience, right? So there's numerous possibilities, right? Ways we could think about it. But that's what Paul's saying. So he's talking about mutual submission. The children are to be submissive. They need to obey their parents. But he's basically saying, but I know a lot of you have fathers who haven't been good, and we got to change that.
I would obviously think that the fathers he's talking to in this section are the husbands that he was talking to in this section.
Right.
And it's, they're operating not in love in these relationships, that they're operating from whatever it is, position that they're, operating from. And some of it probably came from where the earlier chapters we read, you must no longer live as the Gentiles do.
Exactly.
And so their whole thinking had to change, and I would imagine kids watching that, teenagers are always looking for you to be wrong, they're kind of angry anyway.
That's true,
So they see the hypocrisy in you, like if you don't take the time to, if they weren't taking the time to love and explain it and orient it out of that, I can see where it would be like, well, you made this change, and, who are you?
Yeah. Some of you would have heard the phrase, if you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about.
Yeah.
Hey, such loving parenting, it's like, I'll just make it worse for you. But you've got a great point. You can't raise teenagers and then not be angry to some degree. That's just part of where they are. So you're not responsible for all their anger, but you can check yourself and say, am I just exacerbating the kind of angriness that is an adolescent thing, right? And that's where I can be more careful and sensitive and understanding about, yes, how can I do this out of love? Still have to instruct, still have to discipline, but I can do that in the Lord in a way that doesn't just stoke up the anger, right? But you're exactly right. These people are only doing what they had ever seen. These are Greeks, right? They're Gentiles. They've been, in the cultural standards, they've been good fathers and husbands. They've been doing exactly what fathers and husbands were expected to do. And Paul's saying, no, that's darkness, and now you've become children of light. And now it's all got to change. So it's not like he's being impatient. I think he's being understanding where they're coming from, but he's also explaining these are how things have to be done now that you're children of light, now that you're imitating Christ, now that you're operating out of love and realize it's a mutual submission. And I even submit to my children by taking first, not what is most convenient for me, but what is best for their nurturing. Remember Mark Connell used to say, don't give out disciplines that are the most convenient for you, but the ones that are most helpful for the children. Because you can give out a discipline that doesn't interrupt you much. Like, or you can give a punishment to the child, which is going to require more of you, but actually it's a better way to discipline, right? And so that takes some thought and say, yes, this is going to be harder for me, but that's what I really need to do for my child, right? And I would say that's a parent submitting to the child in love. We're all to be subject to one another. So my needs come in a secondary to their primary needs. Their needs always take precedent. I need to do for them before I do for myself.
I find it interesting how he's talking about loving your wives, and then he moves to your children, but then he goes more to the institutions like where you work and further out in the world where you've got a mixture of this.
Yeah.
And it's all around loving them more than.
Yeah, he's talking about all these relationships. We're not going to start the master slaves because we're out of time. But some Bibles will put at the beginning, like the verse 22, household relationships, because the master slave was a relationship in the house, right? Well, if you're a rich enough person to have slaves and servants, but that was the whole household. There was the father, the mother, the children, and then the slaves, and they were all a part of the whole, compound.
And slaves could even be somebody you paid to do it.
Right.
Not necessarily
Right. It could be the actual kind of in bondage sort of slaves, because there were plenty of those in the Roman Empire. But it could be someone who is more the servant. And it's the same word in Greek, and it can go both ways. Is it just a person who's a servant who comes every day and works on your farm or at your house or whatever, or is this person who's actually owned by you, right? But he's talking about all these relationships, and they're all going to be absolutely turned upside down now that they're Christians. They have to think about them differently. But we'll pick up the master-slave one next time. Did you have a comment?
Yes, we got a little Pomeranian dog one year for Christmas. And my oldest son Chase, I had watched him with the dog. He was around 12. He would tease the dog, like all the time. Gonna give him something to eat, take it away, give it. And I kept talking to him. I said, don't do that, honey. That's not good for the puppy.
Yeah.
So one morning, he's doing that while he's sitting at the kitchen table. And I had fixed his breakfast. And it occurred to me, I could do that to him. And I walked over, I started to hand his breakfast to him, and I took it away. And he looked at me, I handed it to him, I took it away. And he got real angry with me. I said, sweetheart, that's exactly how that little puppy feels.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did he stop
He
doing it?
never did.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
See, and that's great instruction. That's getting the point
Appropriate
across.
consequence.
Right. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing. Yeah, it's a great example. Yeah, it's like the fathers have to figure out better ways of instructing their children, because what was the typical wasn't a healthy sort of way in the Greek culture, right? Yeah. How do you do it lovingly? You still have that role, but how do you do it where you submit to their needs are more important than the ease that it offers you, right? Because we all know that raising kids is an imposition on our independence, right? But we bargained for that, we chose that. So we have to live into that and say, yes, it's not easy, but that's important. That's a part of love. All right, so we'll pick up the masters and slaves next week. Hope you can stay for the meal if you're able.